To my immediate right is Rudo, who was also here last year. We spoke briefly last year. And at that, when you came last year, you were promoting your book of short stories, right? Yeah. They're called 3:15 a.m. and Other Stories. It's on my reading list. So Rudo is a published author of these short stories, and she's also an aspiring screenwriter. She's what's called a bookstagrammer and a booktuber. You know, these Gen Y, Gen X stuff, you know. So she reviews a lot of African literature on her YouTube channel, and it's fantastic actually. If you want to know who's coming up in the world of books, this is the channel you need to be listening to. And she's also received quite a few accolades for her writing. She's been, she won the 2021 Afro Bloggers Reviewer of the Year. She's also been cited in South Africa's Glamour and GQ magazine in the same year as a young Zimbabwean creative and entrepreneur we should know about. And she's also part of many groups that really promote literature. And then next to Rudo is another incredible creative. Masimba Musodza is from the, what should we call it, the up north, which is from up north, which is for people in the south is like another country. We're just talking about that. So we're gonna learn something. We're gonna learn a lot today. So Masimba was born in Zimbabwe, but has spent most of his life here in the UK. He's based in Middlesbrough, and he's done something that I think is unique and we want to hear about. He's written in Shona and in English. It'll be really interesting to see how somebody writes in their native language outside of their country. I think that's something we need to hear more of. And he's also a contributor to many publications, including Sticks and Stones, which is the premier Black British magazine in the Northeast. And he also blogs for the Times of Israel. He was listed in Jeff Ryman's 100 African Writers of Speculative Fiction. So welcome to the panel.
Thank you.
And looking forward to hearing what you guys have to say. So Rudo, do you want to take the floor?
Yeah, sure. Hi everyone, my name is Rhoda and I'm Manyere, and I'm an author and African book reviewer and an aspiring screenwriter. So I'm just going to talk a bit about myself and mainly why I do what I do, which is reviewing African literature, because I feel like this opportunity is giving me a chance to tell you guys about the new voices of Zimbabwean literature. So my writing journey started when I was in primary school. I went to Alfred Bait in Zimbabwe, and I remember I used to write the movies that I'd watched because I had a very elderly teacher, so I knew he would not know what I was writing about. So I took advantage of that. So I would write movies because I grew up around the High School Musical era. So those are the kind of movies I was writing, and I was always at the top of the class. So that's how my imagination was born. And then going into high school, I started writing in a counter book. I would write stories about guys with blue eyes, blonde hair, yellow school buses, which is something I could not relate to, but it's something that I watched, something that I saw on TV. But it sparked my creativity when it came to writing, so I began writing those kind of stories. And then I discovered boys, then I stopped writing for a while. And then after that, then I stopped writing for a while, and then I moved to the UK when I was around 19 years old. When I moved to the UK, I think I had an identity crisis. Number one, I realized I was black. But that I didn't know, but because I moved from a country where black was the majority, when I came here, I realized that I was black because I was in spaces where I was seen as the other. So that actually brought a lot of conflict within me. And through that, I began to try and realize who I was, my identity. And being 19, I was not very sure or very steady in my identity, so it was a very confusing time. And the only thing I could do was to read. Because by the time I came when I was 19, people my age already had these friend groups, so I was more of like an outcast. So I had to start from scratch. And how I started was reading. And because it was more of coming from a lonely place, I started reading books by black authors. And obviously I studied in America. I read Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou, Malcolm X, which is my favorite bio, by the way. And I read MLK, Asata, Shonda Rhimes, all of them. But as much as I could relate to an extent, I could not fully relate because we're completely different histories. I'd never experienced slavery in my country. In Zimbabwe, we never experienced slavery as much as the Americans did. So there was that lacking when it came to me looking for part of my identity when it came to blackness and that. So from then, I realized that I was not American. So the racism seem different. Theirs in America is more overt, if I should say. The racism in this country is more systematic, and there are so many microaggressions. So I could see what was going on in America, but here I could not really piece it together in the bigger picture. And also, as I said, my ancestors did not experience racism, so it was very hard for me to fully identify. And then because of that, that's when I started reading African literature, because I was looking for myself. Being away from home, I missed home so much, so I started reading African literature. And when I started, that's when Americana had just come out by Chimamanda. And I remember when I read the book, I bought 4 other copies for other people because I just wanted them to experience the feeling. And I think when it comes to literature, this is the only time I can accept that Africa is a country, because I could fully relate to what I was reading, as much as I've never been to Nigeria, but there was the Africanness which I could relate to. I could relate to the girl who was looking for someone to do her hair in a country where it's very hard for people to do black hair. So from that, I started reading a lot of African literature. I read a lot of African literature, and I identified with that, and that feeling was so amazing. I just wanted to keep feeling like that. I could relate to the power cuts in most books. I could relate to, different religions, so many things that make blackness and Africanness something that I could relate to. So because of that, because I was reading so many books, I felt like I needed to talk to someone about it. And because, as I say, making friends here when you're old is a bit difficult, I made a YouTube channel. Through that YouTube channel, it's called What's Rudo Reading. That's where I review a lot of African literature. Strictly, I try as much as I can to only do African literature, because I saw that African literature is really represented. Because even if you go on Book Talk or any other platform where they do reviews for books, it's mostly other races. And African literature, I just felt like maybe this was my chance for me to represent African literature. So I read so many authors: Chinua Achebe, Ben Okri, Tisi Rangarembwa, Bessie Head, Yvonne Vera, all of the greats. And with that came so many genres. I discovered African thriller, African sci-fi, romance, history, historical fiction, contemporary fiction. And as I read more, the more my writing was activated again. So I started writing again. And it started as a blog. I started blogging, but because I didn't really have the confidence to tell people that I was writing again, I would write for myself and then I'll post it, because there's a privacy option where you can just read it by yourself. Until I had the courage to put it out there, and then that's how Sam, my publisher, found me, because she read my blogs and she was saying, "Oh, you're actually quite amazing at this." I never really thought of it. And then with that, I became published. My collection of short stories called 350 Name and Other Stories, and it was nominated for a NAMA last year. And I would not have been here if it were not for people like Sam who actually believed in me. And also, I think the drive of me trying to find my identity and who I am actually drove me. And with that, I got to meet so many other Zimbabweans who are coming up. I'll just mention a few so that you guys are quite aware, because I'm aware of time. There are so many Zimbabwean writers you need to be aware of. We have, of course, Samantha, who's here, who writes contemporary fiction and poetry and has been nominated and won a NAMA. There is Bill Masuku, who writes comics and is credited as a writer on a Disney animation who just came out recently. We have Vika Tivu, who broke barriers and is raising the Zimbabwean flag as a young leader in the UN. We have Tinasco Maka, who is a feminist and human rights activist. We have Farai Mdzingwa, who wrote a book which was shortlisted for the 2024 Republic of Consciousness Prize and made it on the Open Country magazine's 60 notable books of 2023 list. We have Yvette Lisanlovo, who wrote the anthology Drinking from Graveyard Wells, which was longlisted for Best Collection for the British Science Fiction Association Award. We have Rutendo Chivaya, a writer, a blogger, and a book reviewer whose short stories have been shortlisted for the Hamwe short story contest and has been published by Brittle Paper. And there's so many new Zimbabwean voices which are out there, and it would mean so much if you would support us, not only in the sense of you buying our art, but also providing history, like what Mr. Peter was saying, because I'm someone who loves historical fiction. Even my stories, there's stories in my collection of short stories. I was so moved to the fact that I wrote stories about pre-colonized Zimbabwe, which I never experienced myself, but because of me trying to find my identity, me finally realizing that, you know, my blackness is enough and that I can actually function within it. I was able to write a story about pre-colonial Zimbabwe, about Gukra wounded through the research. I wrote stories about the first Chimurenga and all of that. And yeah, that is my piece for today. Thank you.
Thanks, Rudo. That was a really, great summary of how you people sort of move from just loving reading and then taking it up a level to start writing and then publishing, and now you're a master reviewer of literature. So well done. We'll go to Masimba next, and then we'll go to questions. And Masimba, you have a sort of a similar experience. Let's hear about it.
Yeah, well, I feel like I'm a generation before.
Yeah.
I was born in '76, so I grew up in Zimbabwe, and I saw it change from the post-colonial optimism to the nightmare that it is now. So we had books at home. My father encouraged reading. So there was always plenty of books, so they were always buying books. And then on television, there was science fiction and horror. So that is what I got into. When I was about 8, I persuaded my mom, because my father had gone trips for his work. He worked with the Ministry of Lands, to let us watch TV after the news. And there were Salem's Lot by Stephen King. Something might be too young to remember it. But afterwards, we weren't allowed to watch Salem's Lot. The impact on my brother, he's in his 40s, like me, he's 2 years younger than me, but it has had a lasting impact on him. And then there was a funny story about that, because when my mom was telling my grandmother about it, and then my grandmother made me tell the story of Salem's Lot, she was a Catholic, and she thought a film where people point crosses at vampires, that's a message that kids need to be taught about, how the cross against evil. So she could understand what my mom was mad about. And then the other influence for me was, I won a prize when I was in the 4th grade for English. I was always best in English, never good at anything else except English. And I bought myself Frankenstein. I read the book. Frankenstein, the academics will agree, it's a dichotomy between like gothic horror fiction and science fiction, because it was about the idea that as humans we could create life. So my 2 genres in one book, and that had a lot. Next impact was Isaac Asimov and the classics. So I was just getting exposed to all this, and I was starting to write stuff as well. But what I used to write was my own imagination. So I would say I just got into it before I realized that I was actually into it. And then as I got older, I discovered African literature, like from the Heinemann classics and the pace setters, and they too also had their impact on me, because then I could then relate as an African person, like growing up in Africa, that yes, we could have all these interesting stories to tell. And then it just picked from there. I did try in my late teens to send work out, and that's when I discovered something else about the industry. They are gatekeepers. There's a very fixed view about what you ought to write. And this isn't just about Zimbabwe's own culture and conservative society, but even like here as well, there's a very fixed view about how, they're people who feel that it's their place to define how to be black. There's a film showing on Amazon Prime, American Fiction. Mm-hmm. I can relate to Mom.
Yeah.
I can, and I think some of you feel like that as well, that you have to be a certain way, and then if you aim to do it professionally, you have to eat. Sometimes you have to think about swallowing your pride and writing stuff that you wouldn't, because that's what pays. So then another influence on me, I've always been an outsider, because when I started to think for myself in my teens, I told my mom, I can't go to church anymore because I don't believe in that stuff. I've just read about the Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, and I'm a Rastafarian now. She called the pastor. Pastor had a chat with me, and then he left. And I could hear them talking. I said, oh, there's nothing wrong with him, just leave him. I said, oh, God, you're going to talk to him. If I keep talking to him, I'm going to convert. Because he's quite sure of himself. Just leave him. And so it doesn't always show, yes, I know, but you can tell. I am strongly influenced by my Rastafari beliefs. And then from there, I've had a few stories out. I've published 2 novels in Shona and a novella in Shona as well. And then a collection of short stories in English. And then I've got like 40 pieces of short fiction that are just all over the place. And then of course there's the essays and opinion pieces. And I've trained as a screenwriter in Zimbabwe, so I've sold a few. One or two have been made into a production, and that's pretty much it. Yeah.
It feels like we have a lot more to discover about both of you.
Yeah.
You're just getting really saucy there. So I guess, you know, Masimba, so you pointed out rightly that you're 2 different generations, you and Rudo, but you know, pulling out some commonality, you know, you removed from your home environment, but you sought solace and you found your identity in writing, and you use that as a way of kind of, you know, finding who you are and defining who you are. And then you've both come up against those challenges of, you know, for example, you Masimba saying that you know, you find out that there's only a certain way you're allowed to be as a black writer. And Rudo, you alluded to the same as well. So there's some, you know, nice commonalities there, and I think it shows the power of words and the power of books, that it can bring generations together.
Not only that, but if you're black, you're only supposed to write certain subjects and only from a certain angle. You know, which,
So I'm sure I'll ask the first question, then I'll open up, and I think there's something that we need to expand on. So your genre is this speculative fiction, a bit of science fiction, a bit of fantasy thrown in. So tell us about how it's received and the challenges you've had with it.
Well, things have changed. You know, you've seen the success of Black Panther and so on. People are receptive. People do like those stories. But I think much of the publishing industry and how it's set up still needs to catch up. And then you've got, again, like I said, there's a very narrow, just narrow space in which you can be, because the assumption is if you're black, well, you have to be a certain way, and you think, no, I'll be black on my own terms, thank you. I'm a grown man. I will not be dictated to.
I'm the real thing.
Yeah.
You need to catch up with me.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But so yeah, there's seats at the table, but they're kind of limited. And every time you read the briefs, the submission guidelines, you just think, seriously, you know. So I've tended to work more with independent, self-publishing, because and then obviously there's challenges of trying to get in. But I do believe that as long as I keep writing, the dam's going to burst soon.
Yeah.
It's going to happen.
So I'll add on to that as a book reviewer. I think it's covered as a writer. As a book reviewer, because I read a lot of African literature, it seems like from the authors that I've talked to and some of the readers, it seems like for it to be deemed African literature, there has to be struggle. So I think that closes the space for different genres of fish. That's not a good thing, because if that's to happen, it will close doors for Keisha. She will not be able to write a kind of genre. So I think now, because of the new voices that are coming in, we're actually redefining what African literature is. It's no longer about suffering. It's no longer about only based on pain, suffering, poverty, because it seems like African literature is synonymous to poverty porn in a way. But I think the new voices, we're just trying to change that. Now we're bringing different genres, thriller, horror, romance, all of that, and even what you're writing about, because that's a completely different genre when it comes to African literature. So yeah.
Good. So over to you guys. Does anybody want to ask questions?
How do you support the Zimbabwean writers? Is there age I mean, this is the British Zimbabwean writers. Do they have a donation page or anything like that?
I think that would be a question for Dr. Knox.
How do we support the Zimbabwean writers? Is there a way that we can go to?
Well, this is kind of the event. We don't have a specific support page for Zimbabwean writers, but we do have our editor of the British Zimbabwe Society review, Jenny Vaughan. Jenny, is Jenny there?
No, she's at the
Yeah, Jenny. So Jenny, I think maybe not in this one, but perhaps later on, Jenny can also update more on how we can support writers and so on and so forth. Because Jenny is very involved.
Which one's Jenny?
Jenny's sitting here.
Just like the kids.
She's the editor of our review.
Oh, right.
Yes,
Okay.
and we do invite writers to contribute to the review. Space permits. So that's one possible forum. And Jenny's also very Pat here and Margaret here also are very knowledgeable about the support space for writers.
Yeah, I'll give you a few ideas and
So
okay.
yeah, so we can have those conversations perhaps in the after the presentations if you'd like to approach them.
Okay.
And I guess the-
I've got Margaret.
Margaret's-
Margaret's been really good.
And I guess we could always just buy the books. I
Yeah,
think,
apart from that,
yeah,
we
yeah.
buy the books, but then you want different kind of support, don't you?
Oh,
Not just buying the books.
yes, so my point was to carry on what Mr. Peter was saying, that he, sorry, Mr. Molife was Mr. Molife was saying, sorry about that, was for our history, because I love historical fiction, that's the genre I really want to write about. So for us to have that history, because we don't have a lot of Zimbabwean history from Black people. Because I remember when I was in high school, I think the Rhoda State was like half a page. And then I know a lot about European history, like so much more, but I don't know much about my own history. So I was trying to say that maybe if we have like people who've lived it, I know it's a very painful thing that happened, because my dad was in the first Chimurenga, the second Chimurenga, and he was actually shot, so I can understand the pain that comes from it. He doesn't really want to talk about it, but at the same time, we need those stories for us to be able to like create our own spaces, Zimbabweans, to further our own history and make it richer.
So what were you saying, that we support that kind of genre?
Yeah,
Is that what you meant?
if more people, like if people who live through it and people who have more information about it can come forward, so that they supply us new writers with that kind of information to write more stories. Yeah.
And it was interesting because you said, one thing that you said was that slavery is not something that really affected our culture, but actually that's not true. But because our history is not told, we don't know these facts, right? And our history is told from a different lens. So we, as Africans, told that slavery was for the West. But actually, when you look at the history of South Africa, very much we're part of the whole trade, right? So that's why it's really important that we shift away from. No, contemporary African literature is great, but there's something that preceded that, and I think sometimes that's what's lacking, particularly in our southern African literature.
What about the government? Does the government have an incentive?
I spotted you, don't worry.
To bring in this ancient Zimbabwean history into the schools? Like you said, you learned European history. I did when I was in secondary school in Zimbabwe. I learned a lot about other countries, Mao Zedong and all that. But I don't know anything about my own culture, and I still don't till today. It really isn't enough. I can't pass it on to my child. I only pass on what I know, what I experienced, for example, a lot more. That children should be taught in school in Africa about their own culture. And I'm surprised to hear that it's not the case yet, because I was in school in finished late 80s, and back then, as a child, I noticed that. And fast forward to today, you're saying that it's still the same, half the page. So, is the government got an incentive for that? Approach the government, Ministry of Education,
I mean,
put some pressure on them?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's that will be another discussion, but I don't know what you guys think. That's not necessarily a responsibility, a political responsibility, right?
Is it not?
I don't, you have to look at the government that you're dealing with, but that's another story. But what you were saying is that you can tell your children your story. That's passing
Yeah.
history on.
Yeah, but
Right?
I want to know my story
Yeah.
before me.
Yeah.
I only have snippets from grandma, auntie, but not enough to
Not
as
enough
a
meat.
mixed race person,
Yeah.
I need more. I know lots about my father's side here in England,
Yeah.
English history, and I have great passion to know my Zimbabwe culture. What was there before? Like, Peter was saying earlier that he rejected religion because he wants to follow his ancestors. That's how I feel.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
rejected religion, and I'm now following my ancestors, and I've learned a lot. But I know there's a lot more to learn.
Yeah.
And children should have that freedom
Yeah.
in school.
Read Bereza and the next book, and you'll get a lot more history. I think you wanted.
What's your book?
I think you had a question. Yeah.
I do respect some of the perspectives that the contemporary writers are bringing in, where there's more experimentation in genre, speculative fiction. But for some of us, writing is very political. I'm very proud to be Zimbabwean, and every time I wake up, I write every day as a habit. And when I'm writing, I'm just trying to talk about the Zimbabwean story. That's what I'm not interested in what happens in Nigeria, in South Africa, or wherever. It's Zimbabwe. And some of us, we're just trying to get that story and say it in very powerful ways that when I have a granddaughter myself, I'm just trying to write so that one day when I'm gone, she can hear certain stories about Zimbabwe that happened when I was a teenager. Some of the issues that Rudo has dealt with, like the issue of realizing you're black. I've just written a book and there's a story exactly like that. So whilst I do accept the new perspective you're bringing in, let's always focus on Zimbabwe. The
Any comments?
Nigerians do
Yeah.
have their own platforms there.
I think Masimba, you wanted to
Yeah,
respond
let's
to that.
focus on Zimbabwe. There's a lot we haven't written, and if you do have the privilege of reading my next book, it's about Zimbabwe. I'm not interested in anything else but Zimbabwe.
But we are.
So Masimba, I think Masimba wants to comment on that.
First, before I go, we got sidetracked on it's possible to recover history. There's a lot of information out there. The National Archives in Zimbabwe, these private archives, and well, in this country as well, the colonial power, the British South Africa Company minutes, I've been able to get some as well. There's DNA tests. I found out I'm descended from a woman who lived in Ethiopia 12,000 years ago. So it is possible to recover, and then of course you've got history that's handed down. So it's not. I know a lot of people say, "Oh, we lost our history." No, we haven't. There is a lot of material out there. But to answer the gentleman's question or what he's raised, for me, I use the science fiction and horror. There's always strong political themes embedded in there, social commentary embedded in there. You just have to read and then you realize that I'm not talking about demonic entities or aliens. I'm actually talking about Zimbabwean society.
Goddess? Oh, sorry, did you want to?
Oh, I wanted to, what he's saying about just wanting Zimbabwean stories, which is something we're highlighting, but at the same time we need different genres, because we're not all interested in what you like. Someone might not be interested in historical fiction as much as I like it. They might like contemporary fiction. So we're trying to make African literature or Zimbabwean literature in this sense as broad as possible, so that more people can write. The younger generation also have books like young adult, like children's books to read, different genres. I think that's where, well, that's what I'm talking about, mostly trying to open everyone's eyes to that different genres in Zimbabwe. Always doesn't. It's not always political. It's not always historical. It's not always romance. There's something for everyone. So yeah.
Okay, I think Goddess had a hand up next.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to say there's room for lots and lots of stories to be told in very different ways. in very different genres, and we shouldn't be fearful that if people then try to diversify, then they want space for the traditional kinds of genres. No, there will be space for everyone at the top, because there are different kinds of readers, and there are some marvelous stories told in Afro that are Afrofuturistic. I heard someone talking about Afrofuturism. I've read some African stories that are Afrofuturistic that are mind blowing, and that are, some of them are sci-fis. And I really encourage everyone to try to look for them. I'm not that kind of writer myself, but I've enjoyed them, and I think it's just good for us to try out different things, and you will see just how beautiful and diverse we are as writers, and and really you're doing such a good job reviewing people's literature, and I think you should keep doing that. It's really amazing. I will look you up on YouTube.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Goddess. Now, I know Kalaji was up, then Lady with gold earrings, and Lady with the red scarf. Did I miss anybody over here? No. Okay, so, Kalaji.
Hi, sorry. It's just a comment, which for me is that I don't actually think one can be political and just focus on Zimbabwe, because the concept of what is Zimbabwe as we know it now, you cannot divorce it from the fact that Zimbabwe would not be Zimbabwe without the frontline states. So the truth is that for Zimbabwe to be Zimbabwe, you needed Zambia, you needed Mozambique, you needed Angola, you needed Ghana actually. You needed parts of South Africa. So in some ways, actually incorporating and also embracing other parts of Africa is also what makes Zimbabwe, and it also what is the political story of Zimbabwe even now. If you even look at the troubles that we've had in the recent years, as far as I'm concerned, part of the reason why Zimbabwe is still standing today is because of the fact that SADC has pretty much been backing the Zimbabwean government, rightly or wrongly. That's a debate for another day, but the point is that I think that it's very hard to say let's just focus on Zimbabwe without actually understanding that the concept of what is Zimbabwe is also the concept of at least Southern Africa, if you're not going to take the whole of Africa. So that's just maybe my little
and so everybody's bringing the same point, that we're kind of late to the game. I don't know if I'm right or wrong. Zimbabwe's late to the literature game, and we have to kind of think of the context in which we're speaking about our culture, right? You're trying to sell Zimbabwean or Southern African literature to a world that accepts, let's say, West African literature as the norm. So we have to contextualize it. So there can be an emphasis on bringing our history through, but even our children, if you look at our children, they all have mixed African cultures now, right? So you have to cater to those people who you're trying to sell history to. So that's trying to just bring all the comments together. Lady with gold earrings. Okay. That I love.
America, I have a question for Masimba. When you say sci-fi and horror, do you mean your Shona novels as well?
Yeah.
Can you tell us about them?
Well, I published a story called Manyere. It talks about illegal biotech experiments being held in the rural countryside in Zimbabwe. So some of these chemicals are leaking into the ecosystem and then creating mutant creatures, mutant life forms. So on one surface, that's what the story is about. But on the other, I was talking about how, like the third world, how far behind we are on issues like biotech engineering, and whether this is something we need to be looking into if we're going to achieve food security. How food security is going to be a weapon for the future. And then I wrote a horror novel with elements of H.P. Lovecraft and so on. It's called Shavage Cut. It's about a girl gets gang raped, but because the perpetrators are rich and powerful, there's no justice for her. So she learns about how to evoke basically Lilith, my own version of Lilith. And then when all these people start dying, that's when they realize that what they did was wrong. So on the surface, it's a horror story. This is the thing, how literature is received. A lot of modern Zimbabweans are Christians, but not Christians the way perhaps Mr. Molife would have grown up. I'm guessing you're Catholic. Yeah, but how they would have, there's this new thing. It started in West Africa, but it's married to traditional superstition and incorporated that into the Christianity. And these people, sorry, I shouldn't say bad things about other people's religion, but some of them are insane. They see demonic forces in anything. They're suspicious of anything. So as a result, when I was trying to get the book out, some people wouldn't even want to have anything more to do with me because they thought, oh, here's advocate. Why do you have this evocation, description of an evocation in your book? I said, I made it up. Because if I was to borrow it from an actual religion, that would actually be unfair to that religion because I'm misrepresenting it. So I made it all up. None of it is real. So, but the underlying message in that story is, you know, if the justice system fails, and usually it fails in cases of rape and sexual assault, because again, sometimes it's a case of he said, she said, and the judge has to work out who's telling the truth. You know, what are people supposed to do when a whole system fails? So, going back to what my brother pointed out, I was talking about Zimbabwe's justice system and how we as a society, we always need to be mindful about how we need to have justice and for everyone, not just for the rich and powerful or the people we like, but for every person.
I like that idea that the milieu in which you are writing still remains Zimbabwean. You see what I mean? You can write science fiction, thriller, whatever, but it has to have some Zimbabwean context because our writing is political.
It can also be universal because
It can be universal, like you said, but we need to see the Zimbabweanness. Writing science fiction, writing whatever romantic thing, but don't forget Zimbabwe. Whether you're in the diaspora, whether you're wherever, things, it's political.
Yeah, and I think the first story you mentioned actually, what's the title?
It's called Muna Chamayone, because a lot of it was happening around the river. The river was distributing all these. And
the chemicals
so
from
it started with the giant fish. That could have.
And that one is in Shona.
Yeah, it's in Shona.
So because you know everybody went out because people want to read that story.
It was written on a day because someone said you can't write complicated subjects in Shona. I said, why not? It came out years ago. I did a talk at SOAS in 2016, I think. That was years after. It even got an award with the Zimbabwean what was it, Arts Award. That was the one based here.
Yes.
So that was a long
Would you
time ago.
would you consider
A
translating?
job for you is to let people know where they can get your stories, because literally when you spoke about that first story, everybody was like, wow.
Yeah.
So afterwards, I think everybody needs to come to you. So I think the lady with the red scarf.
I suppose it's not so much of a question, Cherry. It's not so much of a question as it's an appeal to the writers, but just kind of, you know, sort of within what we're discussing. So I have children that straddle two cultures, you know, they're British and they're Shona, if you like. And I think one of the things that is still missing for me is a way to get them to read some of these books without having necessarily lived in them and still get a really good sense sometimes of what was going on and get them to like really get into them. You know, so I suppose I say this now because I'm hearing this gentleman talking about Zim, but I suppose it's more of my fear is that if we become so focused on Zim and just writing about Zim and thinking about Zim, we forget all these children that are born in the diaspora. And we have to, that is who is going to take the next message of the stories of you know, your childhood and my grandparents and all of this. We need them to absorb that. Like if you know, I grew up with Enid Blyton until I found out that she had issues. But you know, and that was horrific because the books was so good. But I've been able to divorce the person from the book, so that's right in my head. You know, we grew up with Thomas Hardy, those kind of people. And those are stories that, yes, were based here, but they traveled because they, you could imagine some of them as if they could be anywhere, really. And I think we need to start writing stories like that, where it doesn't matter if somebody in South America picks it up and reads it, they still get it. And that's for me the next stage that I feel writers we need to get into. So one of the, and it's a challenge to your writers, can somebody please write about witchcraft for young children? I'm not saying teach them witchcraft, I'm saying Zimbabwe, there is so much about witchcraft, whether it's in the religion, whether it's in the culture, whether it's in the whatever. But I've never picked up a book where, we have horror stories from other countries. They talk about, I don't know, if it's Asia, they talk about jinns, wherever they talk about whatever is relevant to that culture. And I just think, I want to read a really good horror story that is based in Zim. I hope that kind of, I'm trying to get the words out because I'm so excited that hopefully somebody someday will write something but targeted at younger children. So that they can really get into it and they can also sort of. So I would like to ask you whether some of your books that you've written, Shona, could be translated.
Yeah, they could be.
To other languages, not just short, not
they're
just
not
English.
for children, I can tell you that. The adults alone struggle. The other problem that we have is how these stories are received. Unfortunately, with Zimbabwean society at this stage, and this is where, like someone was saying about the government, I'm always suspicious. I agree with them with Manyere. When a politician talks about culture, pack your bags and run, because it means censorship. It means some ideas are legitimate, that you're actually committing a crime in your head if you're thinking ideas that the government doesn't approve of. Our problem with the cultural conservatism is how stories about witchcraft are received. Someone would say, well, you're trying to teach kids satanic stuff. What does that mean to someone in whose religion there is no Satan? Or if there is, he's not a bad person. Doesn't mean anything. And I always say to people, look, you're trying to judge what you see as religious themes in my work based on your religious beliefs, but that doesn't mean anything to me because I don't believe in that. Try if you turned around, looked at it from my angle, there's nothing wrong. In Zimbabwe, the curriculum, even the teachers are they're into this modern Christianity that's quite suspicious of anything that's different.
But it's already out, you said.
Yeah, that one's out, but wouldn't be allowed to. The kids wouldn't be allowed to read it. Gatekeeping again.
Yeah, but the ones in the diaspora will. The problem is, Zim has got its things that. My auntie used to say, you would start talking about anything. She goes, shh, the walls have ears, because there is something in
Even
Zim
here, there was a friend of mine who organised a creative writing session for kids at his church, somewhere in the ocean. I turned up. And you could see, it was like, that scene in the Wild West where people don't know, the stranger turns up in the salad, people don't know, should we get our guns right away or just hear him out first? And then after that, I was told that there wasn't going to be one. And the reason is quite obvious. There are people trained to just see that as the enemy. Not for anything I've done, but because of what they've been told about people like me. And then you get other things,
What is that?
It's compass and square.
Are you Freemason?
Freemason,
And that just provokes a reaction as well.
But that's not unique to Zimbabweans. That's
I know,
much a black
but we're
culture.
talking about working with Zimbabweans. And the reaction is based not on anything that I've done or said, but what they have been told them. Instead of seeing it as a chance to learn, okay, this is a chance to learn what's true.
It's the old assumptions again, isn't it?
There can be assumptions.
You know what? You've raised some really, really important points, I see Knox's brain is churning, not because we're over time, but actually I'm thinking he's thinking this is a good thing for next year's event, right?
Oh, yeah.
Really kind of exploring what are the barriers within our own culture about telling our stories. So forget the external, but what are our own barriers? So it only leads me to say, you know, I'm glad that actually you guys didn't speak for very long, because I think it was really exciting to get this dialogue and explore a lot of things that took to this year's event up another level from last year's event. So thank you very much for bringing a different perspective, for exploring arenas that we don't want to talk about, you know, Christianity, spirituality. Rudo, I think it's great what you're doing, shining a light and telling us who we should be reading, because it's kind of hard to know who's a hot author, right? So thank you for telling us who we should be reading next. For somebody, you know, of such young years, you're doing a stellar job. So keep it up. Both of you are really an inspiration. So thank you guys for participating and for asking the questions.